Hello, Blake Rudis here with Everyday HDR and HDRinsider.com, and today I'm going to talk about 6 ways that you can sharpen your images like a pro without using a single plugin. We're going to do it all right here in Photoshop. These methods are so sharp they just might cut you. That was pretty bad. Anyway, make sure you stick around to the end because there's an actions package for you that has all of these methods all in a single action that all you have to do is press play and they will work. However, I strongly encourage you to watch all of these methods so that you understand how to use those actions when it comes time. So we've got a lot to cover. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, so before we get too far into the sharpening methods, there's some things that I want to cover here. Typically, people will say to sharpen at the end of your photo. So that's after you've done all the noise reduction, all the things you're going to do, sharpening at the end. And I'd say that that's probably one of the best notions to go by. You can sharpen pretty much at any time during your workflow, but you have to understand something. If you sharpen your image and then you straighten the horizon, during the straightening of the horizon, it's going to throw off some of the sharpening that you did by the way that the pixels move and shift in order to straighten the image. So you're going to have to sharpen after you straighten the horizon. So that's why it's a good idea to just make sure you do the sharpening when you're done. A couple of other things. You definitely want to sharpen if you're going to print. You don't want to sharpen if you're going to put it on Facebook. Facebook has auto sharpening in the upload process. So when you upload an image and you've sharpened it and then you look at it and you're like, wow, that is wicked sharp. I know I didn't sharpen it that much. That's because Facebook is doing some sharpening on top of that. You want to sharpen your image before you print, but not to the point that you get crunchy artifacts. And we'll talk about that as we go through here. And you also want to do some noise reduction, but you don't want to do noise reduction to the point that everything becomes creamy. Because the thing about prints, and if you look at just the beginning of photography, film photographs were created from grain. So there definitely is some grain there. Don't get so obsessed with having your image so clean of noise that there is no grain. And don't get so obsessed with your sharpening that your sharpening becomes offensive. So let's go ahead and get into these 6 sharpening techniques. We're going to go over global sharpening and then also some sharpening that's selective. And then there's even a series of actions that I've created that are going to have every one of these sharpening methods that I discussed in this tutorial. So we've got a lot of stuff to get into. Let's go ahead and talk about the first sharpening method, which is the Unsharp mask. So as I said in the beginning of this, we want to do this on our finished product. So I'm going to press Alt Option on this bottom layer and show you all the work that I've done from this point on. So I'm at the end of my workflow. I use the digital zone system for color, and this is on a 3 exposure tone mapped image out of Photomatics. And then I use my color zone system for color. I use something called the contrast checker that I use to make sure that there's enough contrast in the image. And then I use something called customized glow, which is new, hasn't been released yet. It's going to be in one of my next courses that just really makes your image pop off the page. And then I did some stamping to remove some distractions, and then some noise reduction in the end in case any of the noise got enhanced from the process. So even I do some noise reduction at the end of my image processing rather than at the beginning, because sometimes when you're messing with tone and color like that, you can increase the noise along the way. And then I did some color grading. Now I'm going to press Control-Shift-E to flatten this image so that I'm working with a 1 layer, essentially, all of this stuff sandwiched down. And the reason is, typically I'll do my sharpening on the top of my image, but with some of these methods I'm going to show you, it might be kind of time consuming. Even with 32 gigs of RAM on my machine, what you just saw, all that work was probably about 30 some layers of work in order to get that. So what I want to do is make sure that I sandwich this down, so I'm just working on 1 layer to make it easier. So what I'm going to do is press Command or Control J to duplicate this image. And then what I want to do is I'm going to zoom in on the background here. And the reason why is because the Unsharp mask gives you a preview, but it's not a very good one. So zoom into something that you definitely want sharpened. And if we look at this, this is Haystack Rock, and it's got a lot of nice, I guess, algae or growth or something on it. It's beautiful, but it's not in focus. So where my focus was about right here. But actually, this rock right here is where my focus was on. So if we look at this, we can actually pull this out using some of our sharpening techniques. So sometimes sharpening isn't just used to make your image look better and sharper and have crisp edges. Sometimes it's actually used to make your image, make areas that are out of focus come back into focus. So I'm going to go to Filter, go to Sharpen, and go to Unsharp Mask. So if we look at the Unsharp mask, you got an amount of 150%, a radius of 1.0, and a threshold. So pretty much the way I do this is I leave the threshold at 0. The radius is going to control how large the sharpening is. So the bigger the radius, the more area it's covering. So the smaller the area, the more minute details are actually going to be rendered here. So I like to leave this at about 1 pixel so that the sharpening happens on that minute area of the image instead of this large effect here where we get almost this really bad HDR look. Okay, so just leave this at 1.0. And then the amount we adjust accordingly to taste. So if we leave the threshold at 0 and the radius at 1, we can now adjust the amount here, or this percentage amount of how much sharpening we want. Typically, I say about 150% is good. So let's just go ahead and press OK. And now we can zoom into here and see. So what are we looking at? Well, we definitely have some nice sharpened area there. Now let's look at this rock that was in focus and see just how much better the sharpening is there. Now this is a global process. So if you don't want sharpening somewhere, you're going to have to add a mask and then paint in those areas that you don't want the sharpening. So I'm going to select my brush by pressing B, make sure that it's set to black by pressing D to default them. And then you see down here, I'm going to make that the X and press to make black. So when you press D, it's going to default your color palette to black and white. And when you press X, it'll switch them on the fly. So you can paint white and black switched on the fly. It's great for masking. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a little bit of larger brush by pressing the right bracket key and then slowly paint in back here so that this sharpening is not affecting that background area. Okay, so that is how you would turn a global sharpen into something a little bit more local by selecting the areas that you want. But there are better methods for this. Let's move on to another global method. Now the next method is something called high pass sharpening, which you're probably familiar with. But what I'm going to do is press Command or Control J to duplicate the background layer. I'm going to change this to something called linear light. And it's going to look horrible, and that's okay. Then I'm going to go to Filter, go to Other, and go to High Pass. And here is where you get to control just how sharp this image is with that linear light. Some people go soft light and then bring this up to 8. I've seen best results between 0.5 and 1 with linear light. And we'll go ahead and press OK. This is a high pass sharpen layer, and you could really leave it at that. But here's a really cool thing you can do with the high pass sharpen layer. You can go and make a new curves adjustment layer, press Alt or Option on top of there. And now if we look at this layer is pretty much gray, or what's 50% gray. But if you look really close, you see that there's actually some darker areas and some lighter areas. So with this curves adjustment, what we want to do is we want to leave a point right in the middle so that no matter what, our gray values stay gray. And if you put a point in the middle here and it actually goes up a little bit, make sure that these inputs and outputs are set to 128 because 128 is our midtones. So we're protecting our midtones by keeping our midtones there. Let's just go ahead and press Alt or Option on this layer so that we can see what we're doing here. Now, as we move this up or down, it's going to make our high pass sharpen layer a little bit darker, but if we move that down, and a little bit lighter if we move it up. And you see, when it does that, it's actually changing the shadows in our image. And we can do the same thing with our highlights. But you notice how there's a glowing edge around some of those areas. Let's see what happens to the sharpening layer when we do that. So if we turn that curves layer off and turn it on, look at the difference now. We've really popped out some of that stuff. Now it's a little too much, so we can bring that black layer up, maybe bring the highlights down a little bit and see where we are from square one. So here we are at square one. Here is our high pass sharpen. It's a good sharpen, but let's go ahead and zoom into that haystack rock and see what happens when we change from our lights and darks in the curve. So if we bring this down, it makes our darks a little bit darker in that sharpened area. And if we bring our highlights up, it really pops our highlights out. So now that haystack rock went from something that was out of focus to something that was clearly way in focus. And of course, this is a little too much. So what we can do is lower the opacity on here, or maybe even lower the opacity on our curves adjustment layer. It's also a good idea to make sure that curves adjustment layer is set to luminosity so it only affects the tone and doesn't bring any color along with it. And that would be our second global adjustment. At this point, we could make a mask on here for two different things. We could make a mask on here for our high pass sharpen layer to reduce any of the sharpening in areas that we don't want by painting in black, or we can do that on that curves adjustment layer. Say we like the curve that we have for maybe some of these rocks, but we don't want that in the background. We can then paint black on the background to bring some of that area back too. The thing with sharpening is that you don't want to take it too far. So here our rock looks like it's very well sharpened. Okay, so it definitely looks very well sharpened. Almost looks like you can grab it now. You can see the water running off of that rock. It's very, very nice. And back here on Haystack Rock, same thing. All right, so now we're going to move on to a method that actually uses a high pass sharpen on top of an Unsharp mask and still gives you the ability to adjust a curve. This is another crazy way to sharpen your image. All right, so to do this high pass sharpen on top of an Unsharp mask, we're going to press Command or Control J. We're going to go to Filter. We're going to go to Sharpen. And we're going to go to Unsharp Mask. Now we'll just leave the Unsharp Mask from the exact same settings we had before. Press OK. And now what we're going to do is change that to linear light. So now we're high pass sharpening and Unsharp Mask. Okay, and go to Other and go to High Pass. And we're going to leave that at 0.9. So we can see here that we have a really, really well done sharpen for that background area. It's almost as if that Haystack Rock area is in perfect focus, even though I had no focus on that rock, on Haystack Rock, period. And then you got this rock here. If we turn the sharpening layer on and off, it's very well sharpened, almost too sharpened. So at that point, we could go in here and we could drop the opacity a little bit on here. We could also zoom into here and make that curves adjustment layer. So curves adjustment layer on top of there, Alt or Option, so that it only affects that high pass sharpen Unsharp mask. Make sure that this is set at 128, 128 so that we don't change any of our midtones. And now, if maybe the highlight portions of our sharpen were too much, we can just drop that down. And as we drop that down, it reduces the amount of sharpening on our highlight areas. Same thing with our shadows. If we bring it down, it's going to increase our shadow sharpening. If we bring it up, it's going to reduce our shadow sharpening, almost to the point that it starts to create a blur. So you see how sharpening and blurring are very close to one another. Sharpening and noise reduction are very close to one another. One kind of blurs and blends pixels, and another one makes the edges on the pixels nice and clean. So now let's zoom out and see what's happening to our Haystack Rock in the background here. And there's the before and there's the after. Again, another thing that's going to be global, if you want to make your adjustments on here, you click this layer, make a mask, and paint in black on areas that you don't want to be affected, because sometimes you don't want the entire image to be sharpened, especially with those clouds in the background. We want those to remain smooth and creamy, and if we want those to remain smooth and creamy, we definitely have to do some masking there. So now what we're going to do is go in and look at some sharpening methods that are very selective in nature by the way that we create them. The first one we're going to look at is Adobe Camera Raw sharpening. All right, so I'm using Photoshop CC. So all I have to do to use Camera Raw for the sharpening capabilities is press Command or Control J on my background layer to duplicate it. Press Control Shift A. Control Shift A is the hotkey for the filter, the Adobe Camera Raw filter. However, I have to say that this only works in Photoshop CC. If you're using anything before Photoshop CC, you can't do it this way. You'll have to save the image and then bring it back into Photoshop as a TIFF so that you can work on it in Adobe Camera Raw by going back into Adobe Camera Raw. The benefit of CC is definitely having Photoshop CC as a filter. So where you're going to find the sharpening is in the details section. And typically when we look at the details section here, you're going to see that we have a radius again, and then we also have a detail and an amount. It's very much like our radius and our threshold and our amount that you see in the Unsharp mask. It's very, very similar. So let me go ahead and zoom in here and show what we're going to do with this. So let's go ahead and take a look at the radius first. If we increase the radius, let's just go ahead and bring our sharpening all the way up so we can see what happens. That amount's all the way up. We increase the radius to 3 pixels. You can see that it becomes a very large sharpen. And move it down to 1 pixel, it's a very small sharpen. We can zoom in even closer and see this. But like I said before, you see how this is kind of getting what I call crunchy? It almost looks like you took a bag of potato chips, crunched them up, and threw them onto a table. And you see all the little sharp edges on each one of those little individual chips. So you see, as you bring the radius up, we also kind of get a glow around the edges. This isn't what we want. I would never take my sharpening in Adobe Camera Raw up to 150. Typically, I will leave the radius at 1. And let's go ahead and bring our detail up and down so we can see what happens with detail. Detail is like an amplified slider. So it'll take all of your detail in your image and amplify the amount of detail that comes along with that sharpening. I would typically leave this between 5 and 15. So if you leave this between about 5 and 15, let's just say 10 pixels for this, you can then adjust the amount of your sharpening based on the amount, and that's it. Now, what you're looking at is that this is sharpening the entire image, right? Well, there's a masking capability down here. If you move the masking to the right, it's masking something, but you have no idea what it's masking. If you press Alt or Option while you click on that mask and move it, it's going to show you the areas in black are not being affected by our sharpen, and areas in white are being affected by our sharpen. You see how this is like an automatic protection for your shadow areas. Typically, I will tell all the people when I'm doing any kind of tutorial on sharpening is that you do not want to sharpen your shadows, because a lot of times you get color noise in those shadows, and that color noise really comes out when you sharpen. So if we press Alt or Option here, you can see that a lot of our shadow areas are being protected, and a lot of our highlight areas are being protected. We move all the way over, and it's pretty much only touching some of our mid-tone areas there. So let's go ahead and move that to about 50 and see what happens. Let's go ahead and zoom into some of these areas here. So if we bring the masking all the way down, bring the masking all the way up to where we had it about 50, you can see that some of our shadow areas are being protected there. Mainly in this, it's going to be our highlight areas. I'll show you another technique for protecting shadows. So here we have pretty much just our highlight areas being protected, and anything in the background. Our clouds are not being sharpened now. Like I told you before, you can use a mask and you can paint that area in, but in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, you press Alt or Option on that masking, and it'll show you exactly what you're sharpening and what you're not sharpening, so that you can mask out areas that you don't want to be sharpened negatively, like we said before in those clouds. And you press OK, and that will bring you right back into Photoshop, and you now have your sharpening that you've just done in Adobe Camera Raw right here as a layer in Photoshop. Definitely a very helpful tool to have Photoshop CC as a filter. You know, I'm an Adobe advocate. I do not get paid by them, but I will tell you this: Adobe Camera Raw as a filter is worth $9.99 a month. Boom, done. Drop the mic. So now I'm going to show you one of my favorite ways to sharpen. It's a very, very selective way to sharpen, because what you're doing is you're really navigating the viewer's eye to a certain area. Our viewer is going to be attracted to a certain number of things in our photographs. Number one, areas of high saturation. Number two, areas of highlight. So your white areas are where the eye is going to navigate to first, and then you're going to navigate to areas of high detail. So there's certain things that are going to pop out and grab you right away, and then there's other things that your eye is going to navigate around to look for. So let's go ahead and pick on Haystack Rock, because it's kind of out of focus. So what I'm going to do is Control click here, make a new layer. I'm going to click on my Sharpen tool. It's right here. Make sure it's set to 25%, sample all layers, protect details unchecked, and if you're using a Wacom tablet, you can use this for pressure sensitivity if you'd like. I'll go ahead and use it because I have a Wacom tablet. And I'm just going to go ahead and start painting in on this area. And you'll see it might not be working so fast, but we have a trick to speed this up. So I'm going to press Alt or Option on this eyeball so I can show you that these are the areas that are going to be sharpened. And I'll just go ahead and paint the entire Haystack Rock here. Now this one is really tricky. You don't want to speed it up by going to something like 50%, because it'll create some really nasty, crunchy artifacts that you don't really want. Let's press Alt or Option and see the sharpening that we've got on our Haystack Rock here. And I'm just going to go ahead and fill in some of these other areas, and I'm just being really casual about it. Press Alt or Option on there and see, okay, we're doing pretty well. So now what we can do is very similar to that last technique with the Unsharp mask and the high pass sharpen. We'll change this to linear light. We'll go to filter. We'll go to other, and we'll go to high pass. So now we've got a linear light high pass, very similar to what we did with the Unsharp mask. Now, if you set your brush at 50% or 75% because you wanted to speed things up and then try this, it's going to get really nasty. So don't do that. Just leave it at 25%. And even the smallest of areas that you end up getting in your brush. So if you have a soft edge brush, even some of those soft areas are going to get this detail enhancement. You can see that as we bring this up. So let's go ahead and keep that radius between 0.5 and 1.0. Press OK because we're at about 0.8. And we'll zoom in here and we'll see. We've got some really pretty crazy sharpening happening here on this high pass sharpen tool. Very selective way because you paint in that sharpening. The problem with using just the sharpen tool without using the high pass sharpen with it is it takes a long time to build that up. And when you do build it up, a lot of times you get really bad artifacts from sharpening too much with the sharpen tool. So using the high pass sharpen with the sharpening tool is a really great way to pull out some of that detail that wasn't there before. And last but not least, I want to show one of my favorite techniques for sharpening. I talked about sharpening, not sharpening your highlights and not sharpening your shadows, and only really sharpening your midtones. So how do we do that in a way that we don't have to use a complex mask? Well, let's do this. Command or Control J to duplicate our background layer. Go to our linear light, go to Filter, Other, High Pass, and we'll change that to something like 1.0 for this will work. So 1.0. Press OK. So now we've got a really strong global sharpen happening to our entire image. Let's go ahead and pick on Haystack Rock because it's got a lot of stuff here for us to look at when we do this. There's some shadow areas right in here, and there's also some highlight areas right here. So let's look at ways that we can protect those areas. If we double click right here, it's going to open us up into what's called the layer styles. Okay, so now down here you have something called blend if. And what that means is that if the underlying layer is black or white, we want to protect it from what's happening with this layer. So we want to protect our shadows. Watch what happens as we move the black part over. You see what happens back there? As we move this over, way back in that back area, everything in the shadow areas up to at 128 our midtones is now protected. But it's happening in a very quick way, meaning it's very blocky. So if we press Alt or Option, we can say, okay, protect everything in, let's say, zone 0. So our darkest darks will not have any sharpening whatsoever. Press Alt or Option, and let's move this up to about maybe our zone 3 or zone 4 area so that our midtone areas, our zone 4 and zone 5, will still have the sharpening. Same thing over here. Let's go ahead and press OK, and we're going to zoom into our background here so we can really see this. So you can see that in the background we have a lot of this area that is sharpened that we don't want sharpened. So I'll double click here and we'll look at our layer styles again. We'll move this over and you start to see that, boom, right there at about this mark, which is 208. That's about zone 8. At about zone 8, we don't want that to be sharpened at all because what that's doing is it's sharpening our background area. Press Alt or Option to split this and boom. We now have our highlights and our shadows completely protected from a sharpening. So we'll zoom in here to this rock. Did we sharpen the rock? We sure did. But our highlights and our shadows are protected along the way. Let's look at Haystack Rock. Did we sharpen it? We sure did, but our highlights and shadows are separated. So with sharpening, it's definitely one of those things that you want to do it with all your images, but you want to be careful with it. You don't want to take it too far because if you take it too far, things get really nasty and really crunchy and it just doesn't look good. So I know that was a lot to cover. So what I did was I created a series of actions for you that do all of this work for you. So let's look at these actions. Okay, so after you open that .atn file, you're going to see right here this sharpening with Blake Rudis. Okay, so the first one was the Unsharp mask. If you press play, it's going to create an Unsharp mask layer. It's going to be already done for you, and it's also going to open up as a smart object because some images are going to have a higher pixel count than others. So your Unsharp mask might need to be stronger or slighter than mine. So I'll even tell you a message here. The new Sharpen layer is now a smart object. At any time, you can adjust that smart object by double clicking right here at the Unsharp mask. It'll open up that Unsharp mask and it'll let you go ahead and go about your day. So let's look at the next one. Press play on the high pass. Same exact thing. It's going to run through, it's going to do a high pass sharpen, and then it's going to give you that curves adjustment layer that's right here. So you just put that, you have to put that midpoint there yourself at 128 and 128, and now you can move this up and down to get your high pass sharpen. So it gives you a high pass sharpen layer and it also gives you a curves adjustment layer with that high pass sharpen, just like I showed you in that module. Same thing here. The Unsharp mask plus the high pass, press play. It's going to duplicate your background layer. It's going to do an Unsharp mask. Then it's going to do the high pass on the Unsharp mask and give it to you on a smart filter. So at any time, you can go back through and you can double click any of these areas for either the high pass or for the Unsharp mask. So if we double click that, it'll bring us back to the high pass. If you need more or less, you adjust it accordingly. Double click the Unsharp mask and it'll do the same thing for you there. You can redo the Unsharp mask as you see fit. And then you also have your curves adjustment layer here so that you can do the same exact thing. Because it's a high pass layer and it's got that gray tone to it, make sure that you protect your grays by making that 128 128, and now you are free to go in and adjust your sharpening accordingly. All right, next one, Adobe Camera Raw as a filter. Press play. By default, what it's going to do is it's going to go right into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter, make all the settings for you, and then allow you to adjust that as a smart object. So if you wanted to go back in there, the default settings that I've chosen will be there. That 150 at 1.0 with a detail of 10. So kind of what we talked about in that last module. So make sure that you go in there and you adjust yours accordingly as well, because you might need a different mask on there. Also remember, this will only work in Photoshop CC. If you don't have Photoshop CC, number 4, action will not run. The next action we have here is the Sharpen tool, that little wicked Sharpen tool. Now, here's the thing. If you press play here, it's not going to do anything. You have to go to 5A. It's going to create your new Sharpen layer. It's going to tell you, use the Sharpen tool from the menu. Make sure sample all layers is selected. And then once you've done that, after you've sharpened something up a little bit, it's already going to have your Sharpen tool set by default. So we'll just click here. After you've done that, you go to 5B and press 5B right on that Unsharpen. And then that's going to tell you that you want to keep this between 0.5 and 1.0. So there's all these messages along the way that'll give you reminders on what you're supposed to be doing. Press OK. And then it's also going to give you the curves adjustment layer so that you can adjust that curve on top, just like we talked in the module on this Sharpen method. And then the last but not least is the protect highlights and shadows one. Go ahead and press play on this. It'll make a new layer. It'll tell you about the curve adjustment layer that it's putting on top of there. And it'll also, by default, it'll have those areas protected that we discussed in the video. It's a little less on the highlight side, but definitely you don't want those shadow areas to be adjusted for your sharpening. Definitely want to protect shadows from sharpening. Otherwise, they get that really noisy color noise in there. We'll press OK. If at any time you want to use this blend if on any of the other options, you can. So just because it's protected here doesn't mean you can't do that with something like this one. We'll go ahead and press play on this Unsharp mask and high pass. So press play on that action. It'll run us through. Some of them take longer than others. Awkward silence. Press continue. And then here, if we double click right here, it's already done the Unsharp mask for us. Let's go ahead and zoom in here. If we wanted to protect certain areas, we just double click inside those blending options and protect it just as we did in that module. So we'll move this over and protect those shadow areas. Alter option to split it. Same thing with our highlights. And that, to me, is the best sharpening method known to man, is when you protect your highlights and your shadows. No matter what sharpening method you choose, that shadows and highlights protection is really important so that your shadow areas don't become really crunchy. So now I hope you know just about everything you need to know about sharpening in Photoshop and realize that you don't need any plugins to do sharpening. It's all right here in Photoshop. You've got the Unsharp mask that we discussed. You've got the high pass. You've got Unsharp mask on a high pass. You've got Adobe Camera Raw, which is one of the most powerful programs in the world to use on raw images, especially for the noise reduction and for the sharpening. You also have the Sharpen tool, where you can really use that very selective sharpening that we can get really crazy about and really make certain things really sharpened. Don't take it too far, remember. And then we have the protection measures that we can put in place on any one of these sharpened layers. There's a lot of stuff to understand with sharpening, but the thing is, don't go over sharpened, because if you over sharpen, it's really hard to correct for, especially if you save your image afterwards. You don't want to sharpen for Facebook. You do want to sharpen for print. Sometimes if I sharpen when I put stuff on my website, I don't sharpen it as much as I would for sharpening for print, because in print I want things to pop out a little bit more. So sometimes it's a good idea to take your sharpening measures a little bit higher in print than you would if you were posting it online. because things will look different on that printed medium where the ink goes up against those edges. So once again, my name is Blake Rudis with Everyday HDR and HDRinsider.com, and this is just about everything I know about sharpening in Photoshop. If you like this, please comment on it, share it. There's a lot of stuff here with these actions. Go on over to Everyday HDR and download those actions because they're available for you. Thank you very much for watching this.